LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, how Jensen Huang took NVIDIA from laughingstock to the most valuable company in the world. In 1973, a typical school day for Jensen Huang, age 10, began like this. He awoke in his dormitory at the Oneida Baptist Institute, a boarding school in southeastern Kentucky, surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains, and not much else. He'd enrolled there at the behest of his uncle, who believed Oneida was a prestigious prep school. In fact, it was a religious reform academy. Jensen's classmates were malcontented reprobates. Everyone smoked. Many carried pocket knives for self-defense. Some were illiterate. To them, Jensen was the perfect target. Unusually small for his age and speaking very little English, he'd only recently immigrated from Taiwan, Jensen attracted bullies the way a bare light bulb attracts mosquitoes. They shoved him in the hallways, chased him on the playground, hurled every racist epithet you can imagine, and some you probably can't. But their favorite stratagem was to surprise him on his way to school, which required crossing a rope bridge.
It's like a bridge from Temple of Doom. This swinging rope bridge with planks, okay? And the planks are busted. You can see through and there's a frigid river below you.
That's Jensen's biographer and my guest today, Stephen Witt. As he tells it, Jensen's bullies would position themselves on either side of the bridge,
waiting for you to be in the middle of the bridge and come out and grab the ropes and swing it back and forth to try and dislodge you. I mean, it's just, Jensen lived through this.
Here's the remarkable thing. He didn't just live through it, he shook it off, one of his classmates recalls. It even looked like he was having fun. That's the thing about Jensen Huang. Suffering for him is a pleasure. He thrives on it. Call it masochism, call it grit, call it whatever you want. Discomfort drives him to accomplish remarkable things. Jensen today is the CEO and co-founder of NVIDIA, which for a time was the most valuable company in the world. As of this recording, it's number 3. For any company to reach a market cap of $3 trillion is astounding. But it's even more incredible in the case of NVIDIA, given its inauspicious beginnings. Jensen drafted the startup paperwork in 1993 in San Jose, California, at a Denny's next to a freeway, its windows riddled with bullet holes. Why Denny's? Keep listening. The idea back then was to make niche hardware for video gamers, and for years, NVIDIA puttered along doing just that. It IPO'd in 1999 at $12 a share and was added to the S&P 500 2 years later.
And then for 14 years, it was flat or down. So if you bought stock on that day, the day it was added to the S&P 500, after 14 years of investment, you had a 0% return. It really was not until this decade that you suddenly started to see, 50,000% return or whatever it was.
So what happened? AI happened. Turns out there was another use for NVIDIA's video gaming chips, powering neural networks. These are computing systems inspired by the human brain. They learn by analyzing examples rather than following rules, and they're the backbone of modern AI. When Jensen figured out what his hardware could do, this at a time when AI was still an academic backwater and neural networks had been relegated to the dustbin of failed approaches, he staked his entire company, as Stephen puts it in his new book, The Thinking Machine, on this, quote, unexpected symbiosis. Today, almost every major AI application, from OpenAI's ChatGPT to Anthropic's Claude, was trained on NVIDIA's chips. As one analyst put it, there's a war going on out there in AI, and NVIDIA is the only arms dealer. This episode is about how Jensen Huang saw the AI revolution coming before almost anyone else, and how he risked his company to go after it, much as he risked life and limb on that rope bridge in Kentucky. It's about how the AI revolution is as much a story of hardware innovation as it is about software. And we're not just looking to the past. Stephen and I peer into the future. Can NVIDIA maintain its arms dealer dominance when it comes to AI hardware? Can it unlock new markets?
The next $2 to $3 trillion in market capitalization for NVIDIA, if it arrives, will come from AI adjacent fields. If you want the stock to go up from here, they have to establish a dominant position somewhere else. Where that could be is healthcare, but where I really think Jensen's focus is robotics. Jensen thinks we're at the beginning of like $1 trillion robotics infrastructure cycle. I think he's probably right about that.
Who knows what will happen, but if there's one thing I learned from this conversation, it's this. Never bet against Jensen Huang.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Stephen Witt, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've called the topic of your new book, The Thinking Machine, the topic being NVIDIA and Jensen Huang, the biggest story you've ever covered.
Yes.
Why?
Because they made a foundational scientific breakthrough, or they enabled a scientific breakthrough that's going to change the world. It's going to change society. It's going to change our economy. I don't think almost any aspect of human endeavor will be left untouched by AI. And it was really Jensen and his team at NVIDIA that made this possible. Bill Dolly, the former head of computer science at Stanford University, said, without Jensen, we'd be 10 years behind. And I think that's right. They just built the platform that runs modern AI. And that's clearly the story of our era.
It's astounding because when most people think of the creation of AI, right, they think of Geoffrey Hinton and Ilya Sutskever and all these other folks, the team that built the Google Transformer, the DeepMind guys. And obviously they do deserve credit for the inception of the neural network. But you point out that without the hardware side of the story, we wouldn't be where we are today. Yeah, 10 years behind, that's dramatic.
I mean, this is the most surprising thing that I uncovered in reporting this book was just how important and radically different the hardware they were building was. I mean, we think of AI as a software story, and it is, but equally, it's a hardware story. They really reinvented both sides of how a computer could function. And NVIDIA was doing this almost without even knowing what was coming. They were building this platform on the basis of something called parallel computing, where the microchip would break a problem into a number of smaller problems and then sort of solve them all at once. And this was a technique that had not proven very popular nor successful in the past. It was good for a certain kind of specific, tricky problem, but most programmers didn't want to use it because it was complicated. And most parallel computing companies had actually gone out of business trying to peddle this solution. Jensen took this and repackaged it and sold these low-budget $300 supercomputers. And it wasn't clear even who they were for a long time. He didn't have a lot of customers. Yeah. But then Hinton and his team took what they were doing, the neural networks, and ran it on this NVIDIA platform. And that's what delivered modern AI.
Let's dig into some of the details of the technology here for a minute. The parallel processor was developed for graphics cards, right? Driven by this massive appetite people had for gaming.
Yeah.
How is it that these graphics cards were different from CPUs, the central processing units, which used to be the hero among processors?
So the CPU just does one mathematical instruction at a time. So we just bring it tasks and execute the tasks and return them. And Intel had started to experiment with multiple CPU cores, maybe going up to 2 or 4. NVIDIA had done thousands. You would take 1,000 problems at a time to the GPU and it would solve them all at once. Now, this is obviously a more efficient solution, but it takes a lot from the programmer. The programmer has to be really careful with these tricky concepts of balancing memory and race conditions. It's not an easy thing to program. So programmers had a choice for a long time. They could rewrite 1 million lines of code in the parallel paradigm, or they could just wait. They could just wait a couple years and Intel's CPU would double in speed following Moore's law.
Yep.
And so programmers always just waited, and this is why nobody used parallel computing. Then, in the mid-2000s, Jensen and NVIDIA became convinced that Moore's law was going to die because they were running into basic principles of physics. The transistors, the components on the microchips were getting so small, like 1 atom in width, that they were actually getting compromised and leaking electricity into the surrounding circuitry. And when that happens, Moore's law is going to die. You can't rely on the processor to just double in speed every couple years anymore. And so NVIDIA and Jensen, they bet the whole company that this was going to happen. They basically took everything they had and they pushed in all their chips saying, everyone's going to have to start using our GPU solution, our parallel computing solution to make this work. Now, NVIDIA had done graphics for almost its entire history, right?
Yeah.
93 to mid-2000s is just a graphics card company. So what NVIDIA had discovered was that, especially with the gamers, there was a certain kind of customer with just infinite demand for better graphics. No matter how much computing power you supplied them, they would always want more. They were never satisfied. And so this was kind of the thing that kind of kept NVIDIA afloat for a long time. But Jensen and his team were always looking for another customer like that. Who's the other customer with just an infinite demand for computer power? No matter how much computing we can supply them, they'll always come back and ask for 10 times more. And as it turned out, that was AI. No matter how smart we make this machine, no matter how much we make it do, it's just going to enable customers to ask us for more and more and more. And that really explains their contemporary success. They took that platform they were using for graphics and they found the other killer use case.
But this took a long time. I mean, this is like an extraordinary part of the story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one detail that I love is that it turns out that this voracious appetite that gamers had for ever higher resolution imagery, moving at ever faster frame rates, this like fire hose of image processing, drove the development of a technology that was entirely necessary in order for AI to exist. So in some sense, like one interesting piece of this story to me is that without the gaming explosion in the 1990s and 2000s, we probably wouldn't have the AI explosion we saw first in the 2010s and then really coming to fruition in the 2020s here.
Almost certainly not. There's actually a great quote from Jeff Hinton, who built the software side of this, where he was like, we tried everything, but the one thing we never thought to ask was, what if we just had 1 million times more computing power?
Yeah, right.
It just never occurred to them that they would need that, And meanwhile, Jensen is out there building computers that are millions of times more powerful, but he wasn't thinking about AI. Now, he was looking for scientific applications, but when they listed what those were, it was like medical imaging, oil prospecting, quantum physics simulations of the early universe. They weren't considering AI. So actually, both of these fields didn't know that they needed one another. And also, both of these fields were commercial graveyards.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just littered with dead businesses that had never worked. There was no AI company really that ever functioned before maybe the 2010s. And really, there was no parallel computing company that ever really made any significant money outside of NVIDIA. And so they needed one another, but they didn't have any idea. Jensen didn't know he needed AI, and Hinton and his team didn't know they needed these parallel computing structures. I mean, that's really the core of this story. These two neglected technologies, actually just despised by investors. If you worked in AI in the mid-2000s, before kind of the breakthroughs, it was considered an academic field. I mean, it was career suicide. And venture capital money flowing into AI in the first decade of the 2000s was closer to zero than any other number. There was no AI. And really, there was no AI hardware market at all. No such thing had ever even been considered, really, that you would have dedicated hardware for training and deploying AI. I mean, Jensen invented that. That's why NVIDIA is so big.
That's right. And what a lot of listeners may not realize is we've all seen the headlines of NVIDIA having one of the most extraordinary run-ups in value, becoming, for a time, the most valuable company in the world in recent years. But for decades, NVIDIA was a laggard. I think you said that one of the board members said the chart of the company's stock price looked like the EKG of a person having a heart attack. Right.
Basically what would happen, they were the leader in graphics, right? And they were actually making decent profit off of this, always. But Jensen would take all that money, Jensen Huang, the CEO, and deploy it into these crazy bets, right? This crazy bet on this supercomputing platform in a field that offered almost no money at all. He actually knew that. He was deliberately going to a place where there were no customers at all, or very few customers, because he wanted to get away from the competition. So it was kind of like a almost demented seeming business strategy, and his investors really punished him for it. NVIDIA was added to the S&P 500 in late 2001, and then for 14 years, it was flat or down. So if you bought stock on that day, the day it was added to the S&P 500, after 14 years of investment, you had a 0% return.
Brutal.
It really was not until this decade that you suddenly started to see, 50,000% return or whatever it was. These guys were in the toilet. They were the dog of the semiconductor industry, and people would make fun of them. People didn't believe in what Jensen was trying to do.
And meanwhile, Jensen had this, what looks today like incredible foresight. Well, it looked at the time like a kind of almost nutty delusion. I mean, he saw that the power of these parallel processors was underutilized, that there must be other applications, right? He had to find another power-hungry, computation-hungry application, right, for these extraordinary processors they were building. So he launches this thing called CUDA, right, in 2006. Do you want to share what that is and what the thesis was?
Yeah, so CUDA is Compute Unified Domain Architecture, which doesn't seem to stand for anything. But basically what it is a switch on your graphics card. And you flip the switch and you turn the card over, and now it functions as a low-budget scientific supercomputer. And so the target market for this was research academics. Now, this was a tiny market compared to the graphics market. It was maybe 1% of the size. I mean, if that, honestly. And not only that, most high-end research scientists are going to use a big supercomputer. They're going to use one of these like Oak Ridge Laboratory supercomputers. So not only is CUDA for kind of like research academics, it's actually for second tier research academics.
Right.
It's not just for scientists, as I put it in the book. It was for mad scientists. It seems hard to imagine. 15 years ago, Geoffrey Hinton could not get a $10,000 research grant to study AI.
Amazing.
Even within the relatively narrow academic discipline of AI, the specific thing that he was doing, neural nets, was viewed as an absolute backwater. If you look at AI competitions of the time, usually there's like 20 or 30 entries. Maybe one will be a neural net. Truly, these were the mad scientists. What they were doing was viewed as completely eccentric and weird within even their field, even their chosen field, much less the broader domain of computer science. Jensen is building these guys, these tools that turbocharge their workflow, but there's not that many of them, and they don't have any money. And so Wall Street hated this idea.
There's a wonderful detail. You say at one point, NVIDIA signs a contract with General Mills to simulate the thermal physics of cooking frozen pizza. So they're just trying to find applications for this processing power, right?
They were looking for anything, right? But here's the problem with that. So in the old days, as almost originally conceived in the 90s, NVIDIA's GPU slot-in graphics board was actually going to be one of many slot-in graphics boards. Yep. So if you're old enough, you'll actually remember a time that your computer needed a sound board and maybe like a printer board or even an Ethernet board. The thing is, once you accurately replicate sound at the level of a compact disk, that's it. You don't need any more processing power. What Intel saw correctly was that all those soundboards were going to go away. They'd all just be folded into the CPU as the CPU sped up. But graphics had an infinite demand. And so no matter how well you model graphics, the demand was infinite. The problem that Jensen and them were facing in the mid-2000s was like, once I simulate the thermal physics of cooking a frozen pizza in an oven, like I don't really need 10 times more processing power to do that better. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Like incremental processing power is not going to render the pepperoni with like a kind of crispier look that now suddenly I'm like, making fundamental breakthroughs in science. And so the NVIDIA kept hitting this problem with CUDA. They would sell it to the General Mills. They would sell their platform to General Mills. They would sell it to an oil prospector or some kind of medical device imaging company. And they'd have one customer and they'd make one sale. And that customer would never come back. Their computing needs would be satisfied by, just a couple graphics cards. And so they just kept looking. It was almost an article of faith within NVIDIA that somewhere out there was going to be some paradigm-busting scientist who would crack something open and then suddenly not need one GPU or 10 GPUs, but 10,000 or even 10 million.
Okay, right. So this is a perfect segue. So that individual is Geoffrey Hinton, around 2010, who's playing with neural nets, and he uses a couple of NVIDIA processors and demonstrates some interesting success with language processing. But it's still, you say he's presenting to an audience of machine learning researchers, and he sends an email to NVIDIA saying, I just told 1,000 machine learning researchers to buy NVIDIA processors. Would you send me a free card? And they say, no.
No, they didn't. So they were holding like conferences looking for any kind of use for these GPUs. But AI was such a neglected field that it really wasn't on there. I mean, they would write textbooks. NVIDIA would write textbooks about how to use these GPUs for science. Yeah. And there would be nothing in there, not one word about AI and nothing at all about neural nets. Right. Nobody outside of Hinton and a few other weirdos believed in these things. But it was this speed up that the GPU enabled that made it possible. It's almost as if Jensen was building an engine with a propeller attached to it. And he was selling it for 10 years. Does anyone want this engine with a propeller attached to it? And then after 10 years, a guy named Orville Wright came along. He's like, I think I have something I can use with this for. That's what it was like.
You say that, Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever, who famously create AlexNet, which wins this ImageNet competition in 2012 by a wide margin. This is this critical moment, right, where they're able to basically execute this image recognition with an accuracy that hadn't been seen before. They were outperforming other teams that had used, I think you said it was hundreds or thousands of CPUs, central processing units, but with just a couple of NVIDIA's parallel processors, they blow everybody else away. 2 gaming cards, not even like specialized, like 2 cards you would buy at Best Buy to play Call of Duty. Right, but critically running CUDA.
Running CUDA in Krzyzewski's bedroom at his parents' house.
Yeah.
So like literally like weird science in your bedroom, and they cracked the code for AI. I mean, his parents' house should be a museum now. It was a paradigm shift. He completely revolutionized computer science, literally like a kind of eccentric guy in his bedroom.
This you said, Stephen, that AlexNet can now be mentioned alongside the Wright brothers flyer and the Edison light bulb among tech innovations. Like, this is one of these critical breakthrough moments. And we think of the hero as being, Alex and Ilya, and they were heroes in figuring out how to train these neural nets to execute properly. But in parallel, part of what becomes clear in your book is that NVIDIA and these chips and this CUDA platform that they've been quietly building and Jensen has believed in for years and years and years. The company's been flatlining. Their stock price is down. They're as much a hero in this breakthrough.
That's correct. And they actually had no idea. It took Jensen like almost 2 years to really get what had just happened. And once he did, I mean, he completely pivoted the company to AI. But it was just so far off of his radar screen, even though he'd been looking for applications for CUDA just like this for almost 10 years at this point. AI was so neglected, it had such a bad reputation that even Jensen wasn't considering it. But I will say, the moment he understood, the moment it was explained to him, he got it, like right away. As I say in the book, it was like he was standing on the prow of the ship, searching for land for like 10 years. And then he found Atlantis, right? He found like the promised land of riches, and nobody even thought it was real. It was like a fable, right? No one ever thought AI was going to work. And I don't think anyone thought it was going to work on a gaming platform. But he saw it. He saw it instantly and pivoted his whole company towards it.
And in those 2 years between 2012 and 2014, as you tell the story, more and more researchers are starting to use NVIDIA processors to train neural networks, improving the accuracy with which they could identify images up to 96%, which is greater than humans. Like it's at that point, a couple of years later, that Jensen sees it from the prow of his ship. What does he do? This is a huge moment.
Well, what happened was Hinton's research team was acquired by Google. Once they published their paper, it was very quickly recognized that they had made a paradigm shift, even within the AI community. And remember I said like only about 1 out of 20 competitors would use neural nets. Within 2 years, you look at an AI competition and there's 40 competitors and they're all using neural nets. So the pivot within the AI community was fast. When Geoffrey Hinton's team was acquired at Google, at the time, Google had this like sprawling archipelago of data centers, probably the largest private collection of computers in the world at that time, all running CPUs, all running classic Intel serial processing. Krzyzewski and Sutskever show up. They don't use that. They recreate what they were using in the bedroom in Toronto. I mean, they're running gaming hardware under their desks at Google, and they're outperforming all of the other researchers with access to this giant CPU cluster. Now, the other researchers at Google see this and they're like, oh my God, like we got to shift our paradigm. So they go to NVIDIA and they order, I can't remember the exact number. I think it was $140 million worth of GPUs.
Wow.
You know, and like 2 years ago, Jensen was trying to sell like 4 of these.
Right.
So suddenly, like NVIDIA sees what's going on, Jensen sees what's going on, and he just instantly gets it. Not only does he instantly get that AI is important, he instantly gets that this is the thing he's been looking for. He'll never supply these AI guys enough GPUs. No matter how powerful he tries to build them, he'll never satisfy their demand for new intelligence.
Yeah.
And this is when NVIDIA takes off. This is when NVIDIA starts to double in value. Almost every 6 months. It's like the Moore's law of like finance that this company goes up so much.
This is when you and I should have invested in the company.
Yeah, this was the time to buy the stock.
But we didn't. That was the inflection point.
And it's funny because Jensen was telling everyone this. It wasn't a secret. He's on their stage, GTC 2014, being like, AI is going to revolutionize society. And people were like, okay, Jensen, you know, like he was right.
And Jensen says to you, referring to this 2014 realization around what's happening with computer vision, if it could solve computer vision, if neural nets can solve computer vision, what else can you teach it? Basically anything. It was clear to him that computer vision was just the beginning of what was possible with this technology. And so how dramatic is his messaging to the company at that time about how they're shifting priorities to support this future?
The maximum drama. I mean, Jensen's a kind of born entertainer anyway. He's got a lot of charisma as a CEO, and he will stand up there in front of his employees and kind of just talk without notes for 2 hours, just whatever pops into his head. With this, he was convinced that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And he actually would write that down and say it at company meetings. He had an acronym, OIALO, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
I love that.
And he was just drilling that into everybody at the place. He was like, this is our chance. This is it. You know, like this is our moment for this company to write our name in the history books. This was 10 years ago. It was not obvious to anyone outside of NVIDIA that this stuff was, even his own AI guys were a little skeptical privately because they said, you know, God, we've heard this story before with AI, that it's going to come along and revolutionize society, and it didn't work. And we've heard it before with parallel computing, that it was going to come along and turbocharge computers, and that didn't work either. So, you know, we really have to kind of believe in the vision of the boss here that he sees something that we don't.
Right.
And he did. And he did. He said he was reasoning forward from first principles, that it is not an article of faith. I should make this point clear. Jensen's very analytical. He's got an engineer's mind.
Yep.
And what he saw was just a extremely powerful new lever that he could push.
in 2014, this is still 8 years before the release of ChatGPT, and it was still 2 years before Google's release of its neural machine translation system,
Yes.
which I remember reading a cover story in New York Times Magazine about this breakthrough that Google had made in basically using neural nets to create better translation.
Yeah.
That was my wake-up moment at the end of 2016. This is 2 years earlier, right? And these guys are just reprioritizing the whole company around AI.
The other thing I think Jensen was seeing, so Jensen spends a lot of time on the front lines talking to customers. Now, Jensen's customers are some of the smartest people alive. It's the head of particle physics at Caltech. It's, the head of the computer science department at Stanford University. And so he's talking to these guys and he's seeing their excitement about this technology. He's just reading their faces. They're talking about AI. At the time, we've got a fundamental breakthrough in AI, the holy grail of computer science. We see it now for the first time in our lives. And Jensen sees these guys talking about it this way. And these guys, they're not investors. They're not VCs. They're academics, right? They're academic computer scientists. And they're talking about AI all of a sudden as if it's going to be a civilizational advancement. And so Jensen read that, I guess I would call it almost like energy off these guys too. And I think that did a lot to convince him.
What we've seen since is one of the greatest run-ups in stock value of a tech company in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Right? It's just an extraordinary meteoric rise of NVIDIA. And Jensen becomes and is arguably to this day the most powerful individual in the tech world, which is to say really the most powerful individual in the business world, you might argue. And tech titans, you point out, literally beg for his favor.
Yeah.
Can you describe some of this? Or maybe if you want more color around this incredible rise of NVIDIA and the position that Jensen occupies today.
Sure. So just like in the past where the gamers would build an entire rig around an NVIDIA GPU, now you have companies building basically their entire business strategy around an airplane hangar full of GPUs, like a data center with 10,000 GPUs in it. One thing Sutskever sussed out very early, the guy who co-founded AlexNet, was that there was really no limit to the amount of computing power that a neural net could absorb. The way to think about it, or the way he thinks about it, is like evolution. So we start with the earliest brain in a trilobite, an early kind of marine fossil. It's maybe the size of a grain of rice. And then over 500 million years of conditioning, we end up with these kind of remarkable organs inside of our skulls. GPUs want to accelerate that. They want to take the kind of seeds of the neural net and instead of taking 500 million years to have it happen in 500 days or 50 hours. And so this is what the GPU achieves. It rapidly evolves these neural networks much faster than kind of physical evolution does.
Right. Scaling laws.
This is the scaling law. And what that creates is the infinite demand for more computer power that the gamers also have. And it's actually very rare to find a customer with infinite demand for computing power. Most people's computing needs are satisfied by modern technology. I'm not out here being I need to run this complex quantum physics simulation that, has all these particles moving around in it, and I need, 10 teraflops of computing power to do it. As a consumer, I don't need that. But the intelligence side of it, it just doesn't seem like there's any limit in how smart I want the machine to be.
Right.
And so as long as I can make it smarter, I'm going to keep throwing more and more, silicon at it. And so these are just Jensen's customers. The way to see it is it's like the gold rush, and he's the guy selling the shovels.
And of course, the appetite just only increases. We just learned about a $500 billion project, Stargate, to build a dramatically larger server farms to power next generation AI. We've got nuclear power plants being spun up. I mean, it appears today like there's endless appetite. This is just continuing.
Well, think about this. I'm just really starting to scratch the surface of what I want ChatGPT to be and how I want to use it. I remember there was a time in the 90s where I would go on the internet, right? And then the internet became ubiquitous, and now I'm always on the internet. I still am let me go see ChatGPT, see what it has to say, but it's not a ubiquitous part of my kind of day-to-day experience. But it will be. And I think for some younger people, it actually is that already. When the Oracle is asked to provide answers for us, it actually takes a ton of computing power. So if you ask it to write your term paper, it's like turning on your microwave oven for an hour. It uses that much electricity. And so we're really just beginning to see that consumer demand ramp up. And I think within 10 years, it will just be crazy.
That's
and
right.
Right now, like NVIDIA's, the primary provider of the hardware that makes that possible. And so that's one of the things that's kind of being built. That's the inference side or the deployment side of AI. And at the same time, we're, the scientists like OpenAI, the researchers, they're training ever more sophisticated capabilities into these things. And that too requires enormous amounts of computing power. So both the development side and the deployment side are just basically infinite demand curves. They're vertical slopes.
Now, backing up a second, you could argue that this bet on turning graphics cards into supercomputers was, despite years and years of financial failure, was one of the biggest gambles and most successful kind of gambles in business history. How much of it do you think was luck and how much of it was prescience?
The more I study this, the more I think that it was not luck. Yes, it was lucky that AI ended up turbocharging it. And they did not see it coming. Jensen did not predict that specifically. But he did predict very clearly and for many years that if he continued to increase the power that was available to the scientific community via computing, something amazing was going to happen. Did he know exactly how? No. Did he get the broad outlines correct? Yes, 100%. And in fact, once he understood what the specific thing was, he just jumped on it faster than anybody.
So today, NVIDIA is in this position of just extraordinary dominance. Mm-hmm. But they have quite literally the most powerful companies in the world spending tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions, creating competing products, right? You've got Google with their Tensor processor, Apple with their M series, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Tesla, Intel.
Not to mention Huawei, who's probably Jensen's biggest risk. And then arguably the very biggest risk of all is the next Jensen. I mean, some guy in his garage, 3 guys building some kind of like oddball technology that's going to knock off NVIDIA from the throne.
That's right. And yet, so far, all these competitors deploying enormous capital, there hasn't yet been evidence, to my knowledge, of really meaningful inroads. Why haven't the competition been able to keep up?
It's a couple things. One is that the CUDA platform has a lot of, by design, at least if you listen to NVIDIA's ex-employees, Jensen won't admit this, a lot of what's called vendor lock. So once you start using this platform, it's not so easy to switch away from it. So now he's the one benefiting from what we might call the reluctance of the programmers to rewrite 1 million lines of code. I mean, if you're already using the NVIDIA platform and it works, even if AMD rolls out a chip that's 50% faster, it's not worth it. And NVIDIA is going to catch up to them next cycle anyway. So you're chasing 6 months of ephemeral performance gain with a massive, massive switching cost. No one's going to do it. And Jensen has said this, for us to be dethroned, someone needs to do what we did to Intel. Someone needs to come along and build a technology that's 10 times faster than what we're doing. That's how we'll lose.
Wow.
Now, the other way they can lose is if an ultra low cost competitor emerges. NVIDIA's profit margins are crazy. They're crazy profit margins. They're like 90%. They charge a lot of money from this stuff. Jensen's rationale for doing this is, hey, we're plowing this all back into R&D to make the next generation of fantastic chip technology. And it's true. I mean, they do have one of the largest and most successful R&D departments in the world. But if they can't find a reason to have people stick on the platform, and somewhere like Huawei is able to deploy kind of knockoff chips with similar technology at, let's say, 1/10 the price, it doesn't look so good for NVIDIA. And this is actually the reason that Jensen is so concerned, one of the reasons so concerned about selling his chips to Beijing, to China, and why he's trying so hard to convince Trump to lift this export ban on NVIDIA chips.
Right.
Yes, he wants to supply Chinese researchers. Yes, Chinese AI is kind of like world class. I mean, it's right up there. It's neck and neck with US stuff. But what he really doesn't want to have happen is that Huawei gains an internal kind of foothold in that market and then uses it to cut out the legs of his company.
Can I just one more? Like, how far behind do you think China is?
China is not behind. But remember, this is a long-term, this is an infinite race. And so we're going to compete for a long time. And just remember that this is a country with great will, and they have great technical capabilities. 50% of the world's AI researchers are Chinese. And so this is an industry that we will have to compete.
I'm curious to know if you're long NVIDIA stock. And before I ask this question, most people think of you as a journalist. I discovered this morning that you also spent 7 years as a quant out of college, working at a hedge fund as a quantitative analyst. So you know something about the stock market. What's your view on NVIDIA stock today?
This is funny. I actually used to own NVIDIA stock like in the gaming days.
Oh, no.
I think I bought it in like 2001, and it was such a dog. It just was, I sold it out of frustration, and somewhere in the mid-2000s, never to come back. You know, this is a great argument for doing absolutely nothing as an investor once you buy something. Just don't do anything.
Right, but you were reporting this book, and it must have been on your mind.
I think it would have been hard to convince the New Yorker and my publisher that I was kind of an independent voice on NVIDIA if I owned $600,000 in NVIDIA stock, which was what I would have probably owned if I'd never sold it.
Okay. Well, I'm asking you then personally. I own some NVIDIA stock. Unfortunately, I wish I bought it way back in 2014. Do you think it's sensible to hold the stock today? What's your view?
The next $2 to $3 trillion in market capitalization for NVIDIA, if it arrives, will come from AI adjacent fields. So it's priced in that they have a dominant position in AI. If you want the stock to go up from here, they have to establish a dominant position somewhere else. And where that could be is healthcare, but where I really think Jensen's focus is robotics. Jensen thinks we're at the beginning of like $1 trillion robotics infrastructure cycle. I think he's probably right about that. And he wants to train the brains of all these robots, right? So he has this digital gymnasium he's invented called Omniverse. Now imagine we want a robot that does the dishes. We can either train this neural network in the real world using reinforcement learning techniques, and along the way it will break 10 million dishes. Or we can simulate the dishwashing environment in code, in a high-fidelity physics simulation, and teach the robot in there. And then once it gets sufficient capability, we download its brain and install it in a real-world body. So that's what Jensen's trying to build. If he can erect what is essentially another toll booth that everyone who works in the robotics industry has to pass through, just as he did with AI, you know, that's the next $2 to $3 trillion in market capitalization for NVIDIA. That's what makes the stock really pop.
And he has many bets, right? I think you said there are like 50 different initiatives inside the company. Yeah. And the Omniverse is the one that he's the first to talk about, right? This high fidelity physics simulation. And actually, like, I think there's some wonderful, I think, was it Fei Li or somebody did a survey asking people what they most wanted robots to do, right? And washing the dishes, doing the dishes was the most popular answer. Opening presents was the least popular.
That's right. So when we live in the utopia of AI and robotics, the last human activities, the ones that we don't want robots to do, are playing squash and opening presents. That's the final state of humanity, just playing squash and giving each other presents and opening them.
I'm a big fan of robots doing dishes. Yeah. When you think about what's necessary to do this, right? The tactile physics, the fluid dynamics of the soap forming on the dish, on the slippery dish plate. I mean, the only way you could do it perfectly would be to model every atom. But if you can make it very realistic enough, and train robots to a very high level, they're probably still going to, I would imagine, would have to actually practice in the real world. One can see this would be insanely valuable, and not just for training robots, but potentially to crash test cars without destroying them. And I mean, an extremely good simulation of reality for physics experiments would have many, many uses.
Most of the customers right now are like trying to build industrial warehouses, right? But they need to do like high fidelity physics to make sure that it works. So they'll design their warehouse. It's kind of like AutoCAD, except it's really high fidelity physics. So you can really test if this works before you go and deploy, $100 million in capital infrastructure to build this factory, right? So it saves you a ton of money if you get it right. And I should mention, NVIDIA, they're not going to model every atom, but they're going to come as close as they possibly can. In graphics, they have something called ray tracing. And basically, this is like modeling how every ray of light bounces off every object in the scene. And it creates extraordinarily realistic, like to the point that you really can't tell the difference between the simulation and reality when they deploy it in graphics. So they have that training, and they were really one of the first ones to get ray tracing to work. Now they're doing that with kind of like contact physics, right? Surface tension, fluid dynamics, as you mentioned. They won't get every single atom yet. They won't get every single molecule, but they'll get closer than you think.
And in the process of building an extremely high fidelity metaverse for physics experiments, one might create a place that people want to hang out, right? I mean, it's effectively a simulated reality.
This is what I thought they would use it for. But apparently they are not so keen on that particular use case. I was surprised.
NVIDIA has 50 research projects or more going on, like synthetic biology. Is that a game that NVIDIA might?
Yeah, they're trying to be right in the middle of that. So you mentioned, why is NVIDIA hard to compete against? It's actually because of this. So NVIDIA has 300 or 400 software development kits, SDKs. And what these are tools for scientists. And whenever a new kind of like branch of science opens, Jensen and his lieutenants are right there selling these guys these tools, trying to lock them into NVIDIA as their preferred computing solution from the start. So NVIDIA actually has a role. They've won a ton of Oscars just for doing like graphics and CGI stuff. They have a role in LIGO, the gravity wave experiment that won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017. They helped another research group win a Nobel Prize in Chemistry for what's called cryo-electron microscopy, where they, rather than pushing them on microscope slides, they actually freeze the little bacteria and then they can do a 3D scan of them.
Wow.
And so they kind of are there. Almost every branch of science that you could think of, NVIDIA has a toolkit available that will attempt to basically turbocharge your workflow. I mean, this is Jensen's secret. When he was in his 20s and he was working at LSI Logic, before he founded NVIDIA, he was basically in like a sales position. I mean, he was a very skilled engineer, but he was basically a sales guy who was going to the most sophisticated and advanced customers in the world and being like, what can I build you that no one else can build? And at NVIDIA, he would do this and he would actually lose money. He would like build a medical imaging platform. One was for mammograms that I think it cost them $10 million to develop. And I think they sold like 2 cards. Crazy, actually.
Yeah. And he calls this the $0 billion market, right?
The $0 billion market. And he always wants the world's hardest computing customer to come to him first.
Yeah.
So even if it doesn't look like it's going to make money, like he does a ton of weather forecasting, like high fidelity, cutting edge, AI enabled weather forecasting. And you mentioned synthetic biology.
Yeah.
The idea here is to take the kind of 4 nucleotide bases of RNA and make them act like the zeros and ones of binary code.
Yeah.
They call it programmable biology. And from there, you can make bespoke tissue types. You can make pretty much anything you want, any kind of like synthetic drug or medicine. Demis Hassabis, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for DeepMind's ability to do protein folding, this year said that in 10 years, we're going to cure every disease.
Wow.
I don't know if that's true. It's an optimistic statement, but Demis is not Elon Musk. He's not out there making like insane pronouncements. Like if he's saying that, it has some juice to it.
And I think one day maybe we can cure all disease with the help of AI.
The end of disease?
I think that's within reach. Maybe within the next decade or so. I don't see why not.
And I think, again, Jensen wants to be there. And this is what makes him so hard to compete against. This is what AMD and Google struggle to do. They just don't have Jensen's kind of like willingness to build a huge platform for some leading edge, cutting edge scientific program that's going to lose money for 10 straight years before it ever turns a profit.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career?
Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
Here's what I love about Stephen's book, The Thinking Machine. It's a 3-layer dip. You've got the remarkable business story we've been discussing. Then there's the AI revolution. But at its heart, The Thinking Machine is a classic underdog story. It's about how a kid from Taiwan came to America and changed the world. I asked Stephen to take me back to the beginning. Why did Jensen's parents send him here in the first place?
Their plan was to move as a family to America. They were actually living in Thailand at the time, although Jensen is born in Taiwan. And there was a coup d'etat in Thailand, and his dad was like, we got to get the kids out of the country now. So they sent him and his brother, his older brother, to live with an uncle in Portland, Oregon, and that uncle decided that the kids should go to boarding school. And he selected a school called the Oneida Baptist Institute, which I think he believed was a prestigious preparatory school, but turned out to be a reform school for like criminals, for like juvenile delinquents. So Jensen and his brother show up at this place and the grounds are covered in cigarette butts. And it's like these thuggish kids, and Jensen's put in a dormitory with his roommate who's like, Jensen's like 10, his roommate's 17, and he lifts up his shirt to show Jensen all the places he's been stabbed in a recent knife fight.
Oh my gosh.
So this is the environment Jensen's in. And, you know, they're the only Asian Americans around. They're in rural Kentucky for about 500 miles in any direction in the 70s. There's a lot of racism. Every epithet for an Asian American you can think of, they were called that. It's kind of an ugly scenario. I mean, the kids they're not terrible people or anything, but they're poor. You know, they're the children of tobacco farmers and coal miners, and, you know, their brothers are serving in Vietnam. So it's a tough, tough place for Jensen to be. And yet he thrives here. He becomes like one of the most popular students in the school. He's a leader. You know, I talked to some of his school buddies from that era, and they were like, yeah, he was so physically small. He was the youngest kid in the school, but he was also the best student by far. And not only that, but he wasn't just some dweeb. He had charisma, and he would fight. I mean, he would stand up to the bullies and physically fight them. I've been asked about this period a lot, and I think what it is you find a lot of people who are good students. Jensen is this way. He gets great test scores. He does all his homework, gets straight A's. But you also need that edge.
Yeah.
You need the ability in business to survive in an environment where there just simply are no rules. And there's no straightforward pathway to success. And I think Jensen finds this within him at about 10 or 11 at this tough, tough school that he's at. Nobody gives a crap if he does his homework or turns it in on time at the school. And he finds a way to thrive there and become a student leader. You know, Jensen has said this was one of the most important things that ever happened to him. One of the best things that ever happened to him, actually.
And he comes back and he later makes a contribution, dedicates a building to the school, right?
Yeah, no, he came back. He donated a dormitory to the school. I mean, they love him and he loves them. Yeah, it's crazy.
And then he spends some time at a great American institution, Denny's.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, so Jensen got his first kind of like real job, I mean, as a teenager, washing dishes at Denny's. And he worked his way up to busboy and eventually became one of the wait staff. You know, I think about this a lot because Jensen is like the hardest working guy I've ever met. At Oneida, they actually made him clean the toilets. That was one of his jobs. It was like cleaning the toilets. Every student had a job. Some of them worked on like a tobacco farm. All the jobs were hard, but his was like cleaning the latrine. Okay. And then he's at Denny's, he's washing dishes, you know, so it's absolute drudgery. Now we're going to replace all this with robots. So if you ask Fei Li, like, what are the two things that humans most want to replace? It's like cleaning the toilet and washing the dishes. And Jensen did both those jobs. I mean,
right.
he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's done this stuff. It like inspired in him this just extraordinary, incredible work ethic. So weirdly, like maybe there's value in doing the dishes, or at least there was for him. Like there's value in drudgery because it teaches you work ethic. I don't know. So as I look forward to the future where robots are doing all of this stuff, like do we get soft? Do we not work so hard anymore? Anyway, so he falls in love with Denny's, the kind of like classic American restaurant chain. And not only is this kind of his first job, it's also the crucible of his assimilation into American culture. So he's eating all this kind of like classic American diner slop for like the first time, right? Like, cheeseburger. I don't want to call it Denny's food slop. It's good. I like Denny's, but the moon over my hammy sandwich, all this stuff that like
it's
is
not
available
food.
in Taiwan. It's not health food. No, a lot of sodium in it. But he loves it. He falls in love with this place. And to this day, actually, is a frequent customer of Denny's. Later, when he's founding NVIDIA with his co-founders, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, they meet at a Denny's to hash out the business plan for NVIDIA. So NVIDIA was really born like inside of a Denny's diner booth. I mean, that's where it started.
What's extraordinary to me about this story is in trying to understand Jensen and his incredible kind of ferocious drive, this chapter of his life reminds me of reading about Elon Musk's childhood in Walter Isaacson's wonderful biography. We had Walter on the show, talked about Elon Musk.
Yeah.
But you really get the sense that Elon's childhood trauma informs his fanatical ambition. And I believe he said at one point that he would never wish his childhood upon his children, but it was absolutely essential to who he was and what he's accomplished. Mm-hmm. And one gets that sense with Jensen. Do you think, the way that Jensen tells the story, it was sort of, he just thrives and it's a happy childhood. But I wonder if there's some trauma in there that we later see surfacing in some of the just ferocious intensity.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think the ferocious intensity is completely innate. Neither of his brothers has it, and they had very similar backgrounds and upbringings. And his friends who I talked to from that age, I talked to this guy who was like Jensen's best friend from when he was about 10, Ben Bays. I was like, are you surprised that Jensen has like $100 billion and became this like world conquering tycoon? And he was like, no, not at all. He's like, I always knew Jensen was special. I knew he was a star from the moment I first met him. And so I think Jensen just had, this powerful intellect, star quality, like 1 in a million combination of work ethic, brains, and courage to make this work. And I think not only that, it was completely visible to everyone around him from almost the first time they met him. He describes his childhood. He doesn't say what Elon Musk says. He was happy. He's had a great job. He talks about his childhood. He's smiling and he's happy. It's funny. He lectured Stanford University about a year ago. And he was like, the primary problem you guys have is that you've just ticked every box in life and everything's gone perfect for you to be here. You haven't really suffered.
Greatness comes from character, and character isn't formed out of smart people. It's formed out of people who suffered. And so that's kind of and so if I could wish upon you, I don't know how to do it, but for all of you Stanford students, I wish upon you, ample doses of pain and suffering.
I wish you all great suffering. And I think he said also at NVIDIA that if you're not suffering, come see me and I will help you suffer.
This is one of my favorite quotes from Jensen. Yeah. He was like, everything we do at NVIDIA is about pain and suffering, right? This is kind of their secret. We're going to lose money for 10 years trying to build this thing that nobody's using. We don't know if it's going to work. There's no evidence anyone even wants it, This is the pain and suffering of this company. If you're working at NVIDIA and you're not suffering, then come see me and I will make you suffer because you're not doing your job. You're not creating the kind of unique value that NVIDIA can provide. And so this is really Jensen's, what we might say unusual point of view. But, he seems to have had a very, to me, unusual, but more or less like adventure-filled childhood.
Right.
He seems to have had a lot of friends. He did not do so well with kind of the ladies in high school, was sort of my impression. But he then got a girlfriend in college, and that became his wife, Lori. I think he more or less married the first person he ever dated.
Yeah.
And, 42 years later, they're still together. So that's a nice story. And they have 2 kids. And he really loves his wife a lot. And he loves his kids. He loves his family. So what's funny is when I talk to his friends, they present this completely different kind of guy. This almost like goofy, like mischievous family man who's actually remarkably well adjusted. One guy I talked to who worked for Jensen, he was like, listen, in my experience, the CEO is a guy who's pretending to be friendly, but inside is like a very dark kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, I think Jensen's the opposite. I think Jensen's a very friendly kind of person who has trained himself to be dark and tough to be a good CEO, but that's not naturally who he is.
But you've also said once, I heard you say that for a wildly successful CEO, Jensen experiences an unusual degree of negative emotions during the day.
Yeah, he's totally neurotic. So everything Jensen does is driven, and I think he's actually cultivated this within himself, but it's driven by an almost kind of like self-loathing. So, most CEOs are like what we might call a type A person. They're kind of go-getters. They wake up and they're excited to face the day. They have like a million things they want to do. Jensen is maybe the most type B person I've ever met. He's completely motivated by fear of NVIDIA failing, of like some kind of corporate disaster. NVIDIA goes bankrupt and he's ashamed. The shame happens to him. He's driven by guilt. He's driven by shame. He resists any kind of like therapy that would maybe teach him to think a different way because this kind of neurotic behavior really works for him, right? So you don't want to second guess it. And this is really unusual. I've never met, I get this. By the way, I am like this. So I totally get it, but I've never met a corporate executive who thinks in this way.
This almost paranoid sense of survivalism is deep in the company culture and seems to have been a powerful driver. We have 30 days to live is an unofficial motto, you say.
Yeah.
And you think that has been effective as a kind of the sense of urgency around that survivalist drive?
Very early in NVIDIA's history, the company almost went bankrupt twice, actually. And what Jensen learned from this experience is that he was really desperate to survive and everyone worked their hardest as the business was about to fail. And he wanted to keep that sense of desperation even as NVIDIA succeeded. And so, as you say, the official company mantra, basically, or unofficial, was NVIDIA is 30 days from going out of business. And Jensen would go up there and tell all his employees this, and they earned like $15 billion in profit last year. Like, what are you talking about? But he wants them to have that sense of desperation that he has. And it's real. It's not like some kind of thought experiment. He really is that desperate. He works like 16 hours a day, right? So he'd given a lecture at Caltech and I met up with him and I'm like, well, tell me about your day. Like, what did you do today? And he's like, today? I woke up at about 3:30 a.m. and my dog was sleeping between my legs and I really just didn't want to get up. And I said to myself, is there anything that's going to make NVIDIA go out of business today? He's like, no, probably not. But is there a decision that someone could make or that I might make today or tomorrow that in 6 months could create great competitive threats for NVIDIA? Yes, there is. And by 4 a.m., he was out of bed. This guy's worth $100 billion, and he's working feverishly to stave off this inevitable disaster that's going to befall. Now, I will say he is right. If you worked for Tropicana orange juice, you probably wouldn't have to have this sense of desperation. Because you know what? Tropicana orange juice, the product's going to look pretty much the same in 2 years as it looks today. It's not going to change too much. The GPU, the microchip, is going to look totally different. It has to be almost reinvented every product cycle, more so than almost any other product. Even an iPhone doesn't move at the pace that these things move. This creates a crazy balance inside NVIDIA where you have a group of R&D guys who are like, oh, we got to put all these features in the chip. And then you have a group of operations and productions guys who are saying, well, we got to ship 10 million chips in 6 months. Like, what's it going to be? And so there's this constant calculus they're trying to strike between putting the latest features in and actually shipping a product. And the way Jensen resolves this is to just force them to ship a product on deadline on a regular cadence for the graphics. It was every 6 months. For the other graphics card manufacturers, they would take forever to release their products and they wouldn't have a fixed date. Jensen would set a hard deadline out of desperation, being like, you guys got to ship something in 6 months or this company will go bankrupt. And that's how he strikes that balance and makes it work.
Jensen's negative emotions are not just an internal experience, they're sometimes externalized in his famous tantrums. Can you paint a picture of what some of his more extreme screaming fits
So imagine you're there at work.
Yeah.
And everyone is there. All right, 50 people are there. And you're all gathered in the company cafeteria, auditorium, and you botched something. You screwed up. And maybe you've even been trying to hide it a little bit that you screwed up. Jensen's going to make you stand up in front of everyone and detail blow by blow every decision that you made that led to this screw up and what you could have done differently. And he's going to scream at you in front of everybody. He's going to deliver this just absolutely withering analysis of your performance. He's going to berate you. He's going to say stuff that's like mean, that seems like not even constructive criticism. He's going to call your kind of professionalism and your credibility into question. He's going to ask whether you really belong at NVIDIA. Are you really NVIDIA material? Like, why did we hire you if you're going to screw up in this way? It's really awful to experience. And it will go on for much longer than you would ever think possible. 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes. I talked to a guy, he's like, yeah, when they bricked this chip. So they shipped an inoperable chip and he made the chip architect stand up in the cafeteria. And the guy was like, I think Jensen yelled at him for an hour and a half. It might have been 2 hours. Like, honestly, it might have been 2 hours.
Right. And if anybody interrupts him, he just turns and he starts screaming at them.
Right. And so sometimes some of the management will try and protect their employees who are catching heat. But this is like standing in front of a machine gun or waving at a machine gun in a World War I trench. Like, the machine gun just turns to you and starts shooting. It's not going to ask questions.
Yeah, yeah.
So to be on the receiving end of this is very, very difficult.
And you've experienced that,
I
Stephen.
have personally experienced this, and I think what happened was Jensen felt I was wasting his time as an interviewer, and that I was not the right person to write this book. You know, I always wondered why it was me that was chosen to write this book and not Walter Isaacson, right? I mean, Jensen's a pretty famous guy.
Walter would have been delighted probably, yeah.
I'm sure he would have done it, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think Jensen feels like he can scream at Walter Isaacson, and maybe he feels like he can scream. I talked to the chief architect of NVIDIA's headquarters, and again, he could have gotten anybody, right? He could have gotten any star architect you can name. They had the budget for it. And they hired like a completely green architect who'd really never designed anything approaching that scale or scope before. And then Jensen just screamed at the guy the entire time they were building the thing. So Jensen wants, or maybe even needs, people that he can kind of unload at for whatever reason, I think. You know what I'm saying? And this is kind of like his special thing that he does. It's self-indulgent, I will say. It's a self-indulgent thing to do, but it does seem to drive the company to great heights of profitability and success.
So you would say that Jensen has succeeded not in spite of his temper tantrums, but perhaps because of them? I think people don't like it when Jensen yells at them. And I think there are times that he just goes over the line, 100%. And, you know, you do wish maybe he could rein it back. But would Jensen be Jensen if he just wasn't wired this way? You know, nobody's perfect. And I don't think Jensen should yell so much. I don't think it's probably as productive as he thinks it is. And I do think at some level, he's just indulging his ego. That seemed apparent to me when he yelled at me a little bit. But I also don't want to second guess arguably the single most successful businessman of our era, or one of them anyway. It does seem like he knows what he's doing. And part of it is just he's so passionate about this stuff. Yeah.
The other thing is everyone who talked to me about Jensen screaming at them, they also had a story where Jensen was literally the nicest boss they'd ever had in their life. Like, he just went out of their way to secure their loyalty and their love and their affection. People would try and leave and he would like beg them not to go. Like, these are like frontline employees, right? Guy manages 10 people. He's going to leave to go to a startup. Jensen is CEO of a firm of 10,000 people, comes down to his job and is like begging him and impassioned, you can't leave NVIDIA. This is the most important place to work in the world. And there's an element of cult leadership to this, right? It's almost like he's a cult leader, except then NVIDIA becomes the most important place to work in the world. And anyone who's stuck with him has $500 million. So he's like a cult leader, he's like a prophet, but everything he says came true. I mean, like Jay Puri said, I think this is the most important technology company in the world. And he's not obviously wrong, right? I mean, look, OpenAI is amazing, but they have 30 competitors functionally. And who's going to create like the great next breakthrough in LLMs or AI? I don't know who it's going to be. I'm pretty sure I know it's going to happen on an NVIDIA chip. That seems a much safer bet.
When you describe this kind of cult-like dynamic, I'm reminded of your conversations with Jensen about the risks of AI, which prompted his screaming fit of rage at you,
yeah.
right? And the risks of AI is a topic it's a concern of mine. It sounds like it concerns you as well. What is Jensen's view?
You know, Jensen has a totally optimistic view about our AI future. He thinks this stuff is just great. He thinks, you know, AI is going to cure disease, eliminate drudgery, and we're all going to enter a new era of prosperity. He calls AI the new industrial revolution, and he calls what he builds AI factories. Data goes into the factory and intelligence comes out. And he's just not at all concerned about the risks. He just thinks that's overblown, and he thinks people who are concerned about the risks are being foolish. It's very hard for me to adjudicate this because I talked to Geoffrey Hinton, who invented all of this stuff. This is not some guy on the street waving a sign. He built this stuff. And he is terrified.
Yeah.
And Yoshua Bengio, who co-won the Turing Prize with Hinton, is also completely terrified. And he thinks there's grave risks to the future of the human species from AI. That AI could run out of control, that it could create some kind of super disease, that it might view us as a threat and just eliminate us. Now, those two won the Turing Prize, okay? The third guy who won the Turing Prize was a guy named Jan LeCun. And these guys are all friends, okay? They're all buddies, okay? LeCun thinks Bengio and Hinton are being nuts. He thinks they're being ridiculous. He's like, these guys are inventing these risks in their mind. There's no real world evidence that any of these risks are ever going to exist. It's just foolish to talk about this when we're on the verge of like a new industrial revolution that's going to usher in a new era of like health and prosperity and human flourishing, right? So this is LeCun's view. So Jensen is not the only one with this view. And he is not the only one in this argument. It's very hard for me as a journalist to decide who to listen to because all of these people are smarter than me. They're all the leading minds in this, the most important scientific field of our time, and they can't agree. You have one block of technologists who is absolutely terrified that these evolving intelligent systems pose a threat to the human species. And there's another block who thinks that this block is hindering progress. These are Luddites who are getting in the way of what could be like a great new era of human flourishing. I think everyone has to just decide for themselves who's right here.
What fascinated me about your reporting is that this view that is just categorically there's zero risk was consistent inside of NVIDIA, which suggests to me an almost cult-like, as you were saying earlier, uniformity of opinion. Whereas if you talk to people inside the big frontier model companies on the software side, it's very common to have a lot of concern about the risks.
Yeah, I think at NVIDIA, if Jensen has an official company opinion, like you have that opinion.
Right, it's top down. It's right. Yeah.
Like, I don't think you're like, oh, I disagree with Jensen on this point.
Yeah.
That doesn't fly. You know, probably at Google, they kind of encourage diversity of opinion. In NVIDIA, I mean, look, there's arguments. There's technical arguments about what to do, and every side is listened to. But once a decision is made, I think that's kind of final. And so if Jensen says there's no risk, then there's no risk at NVIDIA.
Yeah.
And you're not going to find anyone who works there being like, well, maybe there actually is a risk. I mean, if you thought that, you wouldn't work there because they are kind of the most accelerationist of all of the technology companies in some way. Also, they're not trying, and they don't have to guess where the software side is going. I mean, they have to a little, but it's not existential for them. Let's say Anthropic has some incredible breakthrough It could put OpenAI on the defensive. Suddenly they have to scramble to catch up, or vice versa, or any other LLM company.
Yes.
Now we have to move away from the transformer model to some new model maybe. That's probably good for NVIDIA if that happens, right? It just increases demand. As I said, the demand slope is infinite. So their risks are completely different from a business perspective, and any kind of breakthrough is just going to make them more money. I just think Jensen doesn't think in that way. He's very analytic. He has never read a science fiction novel, which amazed me. He starts from first principles and moves forward. When you and I use the computer, we're thinking probably about the monitor and the keyboard, and then if we're thinking about it all down to the substrate, we're not really thinking about the motherboard ever. I can use a computer for 6 years and not think about the motherboard one time.
Sure.
Jensen's starting from the motherboard.
Yeah.
He's starting from the circuits, and he's moving up toward the keyboard, up toward the monitor. And this gives him a totally different understanding of what a computer is. And I think it demystifies it. And so he doesn't see these same kind of risks because he's looking at it from a circuits perspective. And he's saying, I know every step this machine takes. I know every mathematical step this machine takes. And this whole technology is demystified to me. Jensen doesn't use these analogies of neural networks as like evolution or comparisons to biology that a lot of researchers in the field do use. He says they're doing math, and he calls it software.
As you noted earlier, Jensen was not certain that he selected the right person to write his biography.
I still don't know.
How do you think he feels about your book now? Do you think he's read it? Have you talked to him?
He told me he would never read it.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true or not. I wrote a profile of him for the New Yorker. It was well received. He never read it. Jensen truly does not like to talk about himself.
Yeah.
And it's not some kind of like false modesty. He is genuinely uncomfortable talking about and reading about himself. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. This didn't make it into my book because it happened kind of after, but it did make it in the Taiwanese edition, and I think I'll try and get it back in the U.S. So Jensen was asked to throw the first pitch at a baseball game. And he goes out there, and he's like visibly embarrassed. And he's like, I haven't practiced. I'm not going to throw a very good pitch. Would everyone please look away? Don't look at me. And so he throws this pitch, and it was not very good. The catcher had to like scoot up to catch it, and he's like grimacing on the mound as this happens. He has this fear of like almost public shame or humiliation. So what he does is he gets his wife, Lori, who he loves. He goes to the backyard of their mansion. He's worth $100 billion. He's running a $3 trillion company. At the end of each workday, he goes home and he plays catch with his wife. So that the next time he's called upon to throw the ceremonial opening pitch at a baseball game, he can throw like a good pitch, like a strike. Sure enough, 6 months later, he's in another baseball game, and he's been training. He throws a pitch. It's much better. It's much better.
Well done. Strike. Jensen Huang. Thank you. That was great. Tyler, great job.
So even something as meaningless as the perfunctory toss of it has to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, then for Jensen, that is an irresistible opportunity for self-improvement. And by constantly hunting for things that could go wrong or that would make him ashamed or that would make him embarrassed, he performs at this incredibly high level all the time. And I think that's the way his mind works.
So interesting. Thank you, Stephen Witt, for your time today.
Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Stephen Witt's new book, The Thinking Machine, is out now. You'll find a link to buy it in the episode notes. We've recently spun up something pretty exciting here at The Next Big Idea. It's a new community for writers called Author Insider. The goal is to help authors, thinkers, creators, if you like, people who want to get their ideas into the world, supercharge their careers with innovative strategies from the world's leading writers and industry experts. We do this through masterclasses, workshops, and members-only discussions with folks like Gretchen Rubin, Stephen Johnson, Seth Godin, Charles Duhigg, and many more. Given everything Stephen Witt learned about AI while writing this book, we thought it'd be interesting to get his take on what the technology means for writers. You can find his fascinating answer by going to authorinsider.nextbigideaclub.com. If that's a lot to remember, just Google Author Insider Substack, and it'll come right up. Today's episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.